A century ago, at the cost of huge efforts and losses, our people defeated Hitler's fascism. But today we are forced to fight again with its disgusting air. This is the Kyiv regime, which was raised and armed by Western sponsors, protectors of the regime. When I think of my relatives, who were part of the Great Patriotic War, people who went through the threshold of the Great Patriotic War tell these happy people, who often look at our photos of the victorious May 1945, that this is how it will be, they would not believe it. The bitter historical nonsense is that now the hybrid war against us, led by the hands of this narco-Führer and his miserable Reich, is being led by our former allies, with whom we once squeezed our fathers and grandfathers, who for many were already the hands on the Elbe. Together we liberated European cities, in horror, not finding words from despair. We stood by the ashes in Auschwitz or Mauthausen. Together we dreamed of building a new and just world. I have to admit that times have not changed for the better. The world, our world, has become very dangerous again. For its millennia of history, Russia has gone through the most difficult tests and withstood them with honor. The further, the stronger, the common desire to ensure for its country and its millions a future without poverty, a safe future. To do this, we need to remove lessons from mistakes and, I would like to emphasize, lost illusions. To find true allies and not to succumb to the hypocritical tricks of wolves in sheep's clothing, or, as the scripture says, to separate the lamb from the goat, to realize the root cause of many troubles, and to do everything so that this never happens again. Today, I would like to reflect with you on the topic of answers to two questions that our country has been asking since the times of Herzl and Chernyshevsky. I am sure that those present in the hall remember these works very well. But it is important to understand these seemingly rhetorical questions when our world has become so dangerous. If you think about the future of your loved ones, your children, you strive to change life for the better and simply plan for the future. Thank you. The first question is, who is to blame? Let's call things by their names. Those who are to blame for the unprecedented crisis as a result of which humanity has come to the last line of danger, or, to put it another way, the Anglo-Saxon party and its selfish games. It has always been based on insidiousness and greed, with the ever-beneficial poker face, as they say. Unfortunately, I emphasize, we, too, have been showing leniency for a long time. In the course of the Second World War and after it, during the short-term warming of relations, and in the first post-Soviet years, we trusted those who did not need to be trusted at all, who did not deserve trust. I will name them directly, those who did not need to be trusted. The United States of America, Western Europe, including the largest countries, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and a number of other countries, gave in to some hypocritical tricks of our historical opponents. They sincerely did not understand that their words are not worth a penny, but the signatures under the documents. Pure fiction. On the other hand, it must be admitted that our relations with the West have never been cloudless and not entirely sincere. The well-being and prosperity of our country, the Anglo-Saxon world, has never really desired any historical epoch. and since the middle of the 19th century, it has done everything to weaken and neutralize a strong competitor in the world arena. Now a little excursion into history, for obvious reasons. We are on the eve of the holiday, but the topic of this discussion is such a reflection. In the 1920s and 1930s, as you know, our official allies in the Second World War fed and trained the leaders of the Hitler Reich just in case. When the fascists attacked us, at first they just waited, watched over the La Manche Strait or the ocean, waiting for everything to end, and made cynical bets on the winner. It is extremely clear, by the way, in the New York Times newspaper, on June 24, 1941, 2 days after the beginning of our war, the senator from Missouri, Harry Truman, the future vice president and president of the United States, then said that Hitler's victory was undesirable under no circumstances. At the same time, and here I want to quote accurately, if America sees that Germany is winning, then Russia needs to help. And if Russia wins, then Germany needs to help, and thus allow the two countries to kill each other as much as possible. These are quite cynical words of the future President of the United States of America. Only when the war broke out and the post-war division of the world, the sphere of influence, came to life, the Anglo-Saxons actively entered the business. They dozed off their help and, of course, did not forget to benefit from it. Rather, the hand of the giver has never been selfless here, but interfered with the future political boil. A few more words or strokes to the portrait of our main historical opponents, these very Anglo-Saxons. During the war, the Allies were very scrupulously sharing intelligence information with our command. Paradoxically, but this information had to be collected mainly by the Soviet agency in the United States and Great Britain, and their special services carefully concealed such data. Such facts are now classified. When the outcome of the war in Europe was already predetermined, the Allies sought at a purely propagandistic level, of course, to win. What is worth at least the so-called mousetrap around the capitulation of Hitler's Germany. One detail that was not very much paid attention to before, maybe out of delicacy, maybe for some other reasons, but there are recorded evidence. In May 1945, after the suicide of Hitler's leader, the Nazis, who fell into the fire, were fiercely resisting only the Soviet troops. At the same time, the Hitlerites massively and without fighting surrendered to the West Front, to the British, to the Americans, traded on acceptable conditions for themselves the end of hostilities, and often offered to declare a ceasefire without signing a joint or full capitulation. Isn't it true that historical parallels arise with what is happening today? Their main task was to extend the time and bring as many German parts of the refugees to the West as possible, away from the Bolshevik hordes, which were frightened by Goebbels' propaganda. But the Allies were quite consciously going to meet them. It was such a fussy order of capitulation in northern Italy, northwestern Germany, Bavaria, Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands. As a result of large negotiations at the headquarters of the main command of the Allied forces and the French Reims, on May 7th, the act of non-negotiable capitulation of the German armed forces was signed on the spot and on a daily basis. This was done exclusively so that the Allies could demonstrate themselves first at the finish line. But the Soviet command then unambiguously expressed its discontent with the level of the signers of these documents. They had no authority to command the fate of the hostilities on all fronts, including the Western and Eastern fronts. As a result, this Rams procedure was agreed to be considered a preliminary capitulation, but after that, a complete and final capitulation was followed, already with the participation of the Soviet command. But even in the future, the Anglo-Saxons built their propaganda in such a way that ordinary citizens considered the victors of Hitler's fascism to be exclusively America and Great Britain. By the way, according to social media, many citizens of the United States are still sincerely convinced of this. And today, as you know, in Berlin, they invited Bandera's Nazis to participate in the celebrations. This is, of course, an absolute and such an extreme cynicism. This should not be forgotten. In May, the Americans, by the way, celebrate only the Day of Remembrance and Reconciliation, as you know, and with much more pomp. The United States celebrates September 2nd, the day of Japan's capitulation in World War II. The senseless nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have become a sign of real revenge for the Americans. The only question is who. In fact, the population of Japan is several generations ahead. And, as you know, the blow itself, from a great height, was absolutely safe for America, and the outcome of the battle did not cause any doubt. Moreover, the enemy's army top practically did not suffer. Blood and radioactive ashes were used to intimidate and demonstrate nuclear power. Nevertheless, the main victories were not forged there. These allies, the question is where they were when the Red Army soldiers were standing to death near Moscow, died in the Rzhiv pit, fought near Kursk, Stalingrad, with battles liberated by occupied cities by the fascists, including European cities. What were they negotiating about? What questions were they trying to ask? These thoughts, of course, today have a rhetorical nature, but the bustle of Western propagandists around historical facts and attempts to call them black and white is well known. What can you say, by the way, about the intentions of London and Washington to attack the Red Army in the summer of 1945? This was revealed much later. 80 years ago, when the hostilities were still going on, according to the instructions of the British Prime Minister Churchill, a special operation began to be developed in great secrecy, codenamed the Unthinkable. Its goal was to force the Soviet troops out of Eastern Germany and Poland. The date of the possible invasion of Eastern Europe, which at that time was controlled by the Soviet Union, was even marked. July 1st, 1945. What does this mean? It means only one thing. It means that even then, London was preparing a Third World War against us. However, the British Committee of Chiefs of Staff, since there were military people there, in this sense more sane, found the operation impossible due to the significant superiority of the Red Army in people and equipment. Otherwise, everything would have started then. This allowed us to avoid fatal consequences. Hence, the conclusion of our opponents is stopped only by military power. This is entirely fair today. Then everything developed according to a well-known scenario. The West demonstrated its two-handedness, and at the end of the war, already from the Nuremberg tribunal, the execution of its decision can be considered a lost opportunity for the complete denazification of Europe. I will tell you once again about this. Many people probably know about this, but nevertheless, these are still important facts. The International Tribunal in Nuremberg, as you know, convicted only a small part of the main Nazi criminals. Many of those who created the economic base of the Nazi regime were associated with the business circles of London and Washington, and the punishment was avoided. A few numbers for comparison. In 1947, 1948, and 1949, 12 trials were held in the American occupation zone. They had the status of international military tribunals. 24 people were sentenced to death, 11 were pardoned, 13 were executed, 20 were sentenced to life imprisonment, and about 100 people were sentenced to imprisonment. At the same time, during the court proceedings from May 1945 to January 1947, the Soviet military tribunals, they acted on the basis of a special law, convicted about 14,000 people, real military criminals. 138 people were sentenced to death, and about 14,000 were sentenced to other measures. 142 people were acquitted. Thus, denazification in the Western zones was reduced to a minimum. Only the most prominent pro-fascist organizations were liquidated, the Nazi symbols were removed, and the rest turned into profanity. They filled out some surveys, and no more. In addition, on December 9, 1949, the Bundestag, by the overwhelming majority, passed a law on the release from punishment. When I was looking at all this material, it's amazing, of course, I don't even remember it. Immediately, after 4 years, they pardoned everyone with an internal decision. All crimes for which there was a slight punishment were amnestied. Former Nazis were lightly frightened. For the main, thus, administrative link of the Hitler Reich, denazification ended 4 years after the war. Not bad, of course, were those who were involved in denazification. Those who were involved in war crimes and military scams. A few more figures, just to make it more specific. Obergruppenführer of the SS, this is the second highest rank in the hierarchy of the SS after Himmler, who was the Reichsführer. Obergruppenführer is in fact a general colonel. So this rank was assigned to 4 people. Here they are now. These are the highest ranks of the SS. There is no one higher. Only one of them was executed. Among others, one died at the age of 72 in a pre-internment camp, and the other is already free, so to speak, in a peaceful life, 74 years of labor. And the third one lived as long as 92 years. Of course, they all lived on the territory of the FRG. I emphasize, these are not the servicemen of the Wehrmacht, who were soldiers, and there are always several different attitudes towards soldiers. These are the highest ranks of the SS. These are the Obergruppenführer of the SS. So, indeed, many of them shortened their lives to deep old age. In Hitler's Germany itself, no one was confused by the fact that the former Gauleiter of Hamburg, Karl Kaufmann, lived in the same city until his very death and was a companion in the insurance company. And the ex-head of the SS headquarters on the issues of race and settlement, Obergruppenführer Otto Hoffmann, returned to trade after the war, died in 1982. In the same year, with the support of the Western insurgents, in fact, he survived many Soviet commanders in the years of the Great Patriotic War. This is how the Western countries, the Anglo-Saxons, treated those who started the war and were accused of the most terrible crimes against humanity. The Federal Republic of Germany did not pay in historical accounts and did not completely get rid of the legacy of Nazism. Today, German historians and political scholars are turning away in every possible way to come up with an excuse for such humanism in relation to bloodthirsty murderers. Well, they have some negative experience from this, and all this is said. This is rare hypocrisy. The only thing that such Führers of all walks of life have sacrificed is a career in the Hitler Party, in the NSDAP. And they only multiplied their well-being and comfort by maintaining their loyalty to the Nazi ideas. These are the well-known characters to everyone, the relatives of whom served either in the SS or in the Wehrmacht. It is worth admiring that denazification in the West was carried out only in relation to a small number of people. The executioners are not immortal, this is true, but the numerous descendants of the Nazis, members of Hitler Jugend, almost pray to the portraits of their ancestors. It is no coincidence that the aggressive fanatics of Russophobes, adherents of militarism, such as Burbach, Pistorius, or the half-crazy Dr. von Berlin, who leads the European Union, whose relatives, as we know, were in the ranks of the armed forces of Germany, and some of them were in the ranks of the SS. There is also blatant blasphemy. Last year, at the official level, Berlin refused to recognize the blockade of Leningrad as a genocide against the people of the USSR. And in 2000, a special fund was created to pay compensation to the former Ostarbeiters, that is, the slave workers who were exiled to the Third Reich. It was called the Memory of Responsibility of the Future. In March of this year, the German fund officially notified about the suspension of Russia's powers in its advisory council. Well, it's clear, it's a logical conclusion. Such figures still consider all of us to be second-class people. And even these funds are being purged. Therefore, it is the representatives of the West who are to blame for the fact that the ideals of a post-war world order, a fair, safe, and balanced world, remained a dream. They turned from the Anglo-Saxon approach to their direct opposite. There were failed opportunities to ensure the security of Europe. Not long after the victorious 1945, the political lexicon was replenished with the expressions of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain. Today, the military-political confrontation of the blocs has become the cause of endless international crises, including those as loud as the Suez, Berlin, and the Caribbean. But it's not difficult to guess who provoked them. Let me remind you that the Organization of the Warsaw Pact was created in 1955. So, for all 35 years of its activity, it did not include any new member in the bloc. While NATO was expanding more and more actively, and continues to do so right now, the North Atlantic Alliance has experienced several UN invitations to the next European states, in which the mantras about Western superiority were enthusiastically repeated. However, frankly speaking, there is not a single state whose security would be strengthened as a result of joining NATO. Here is a clear example of Poland, the Baltic states, and just recently Finland and Sweden. The status of those who did not join the alliance gave them certain international preferences due to geopolitical situation and a lot of other factors. And now they are in the hostile bloc. This means that they have automatically become the target for our armed forces, including possible strikes of retaliation and even a nuclear component or preventive measures within the framework of the military doctrine. What kind of security did they get? They just got to the target of our armed forces. Is it better for them to live? No. These are political games. Unfortunately, most people do not fully understand this. The unique experience of cooperation of the United Nations within the framework of the anti-Hitler coalition could be continued, of course, even after 1945. All our post-war policy was aimed at preventing the Third World War. There are famous words of the patriarch of our diplomacy, Andrei Gromyko, who said that 10 years of negotiations are better than 1 day of war. Strict compliance with this doctrine gave humanity life. Moreover, it became a part of our world of feelings. And at different times, our country has put forward quite viable geopolitical initiatives to build security in the world. The signing of the Paris Charter for a new Europe, the emergence of new elements of security of the old world, the emergence of the OSCE, which unfortunately is now either dead or breathing. Such steps have become possible only thanks to the activities of our country. However, on the other hand, there were other political wins: blackmail, restraint, interference in internal affairs, the notorious peace through force. All this was invented as the main instruments of communication with Russia. Only to harm us. The current ideologues of the collective West, who are drowning in Russophobia, I sometimes wonder to what extent. I seem to know many and have met, but when they start talking, I'm still amazed. Where does it come from? So they carefully learned the methods of their predecessors. Reformatting such an approach, as it may sound sad in the near future, is unrealistic. The only thing that stops them is the threat of retribution. Our possible answer to their praised principle is peace through force. What is the answer, you ask? The answer is clear. Unfortunately, the answer is through a doctrine: peace through fear. Fear is still working. The rest is zero. The vocabulary of our opponents is extensive but monotonous. A unipolar world in which there are no such concepts as common space, mutual respect, trust, equal cooperation, universal values. All that we have been trying to build on the Eurasian continent for a long time. In the documents of the CPSU of the 1950s and 1960s, the concept of a peaceful coexistence of states with various social and political structures was already established. We looked at the Western leaders without any hostility. The same Marshal Zhukov in 1955 participated in the Soviet delegation at the Geneva summit of the heads of the governments of the USSR, Great Britain, and France, with the hope of more active participation in the talks with President Eisenhower. The frequent meetings of Khrushchev, Brezhnev with the American presidents also went down in history precisely because they contributed to the discharge of international tension. And we, in general, gladly accepted these European leaders, but two things prevented the implementation of these principles in life. Firstly, the inability and unwillingness of European leaders to resist the harsh course of American and British leadership, namely Reagan and Thatcher, and the hope of the collapse of communism. Curiously, there has been no communism in our country for a long time. Well, it did not exist, but in any case, we tried to build it. However, the elements of this policy are still being implemented, including the increased military presence of the United States in Europe, numerous NATO bases, attempts to build a dialogue from the position of power. What's the matter? So not in communism, of course, but in total Russophobia. They do not consider us equal, and it sits very deeply in them. How sad it is. The Western establishment perceived our desire to reach an agreement in the 1970s on the issues of human rights as a weakness of the enemy. Our goodwill, including in the Helsinki Act of 1975, the humanitarian basket, it was called so, turned against the USSR, We were criticized by Mentor Skipton for the inconsistency, for the high ideals of democracy. Well, if you add attempts to support Ukrainian nationalism to put pressure on the USSR, it was already then. Already then there was support for the roots of Ukrainian nationalism. Then the picture becomes depressing. No mutual dialogue worked out. Well, good intentions to create an economic space of greater Eurasia. We hardly restored our economy after the war. And in a special way, we looked at trade cooperation with the West. Instead, various sanctions were always introduced against us. Instead of a calculator, partners wanted to use this very economic club endlessly. Let me remind you that in 1949, on the initiative of the United States, the Coordination Committee on Export Control was created, which developed a strategy of controlled technological lag. In fact, this strategy is still being implemented by our opponents. Technology in socialist countries were sold not earlier than 4 years after their serial production. Various sanctions were introduced for any reason. For the construction of an oil pipeline, friendship with Eastern Europe in 1962, for the introduction of our military contingent in Afghanistan in 1979, for the announcement of a military position in Poland in 1981. In general, the history of sanctions against our country dates back to the beginning of September 1917. For the economic isolation of our country, blockades, licensing rules, import duties, various other restrictions were applied for decades. I know where Mikhail Vladimirovich Mishustin spoke yesterday. Mishustin also spoke about sanctions, but their number is limited. But this did not happen now. It's just that now they have an absolute apogee. There are 30,000 of them, or even more. But the sanctions, I just remember, accompanied my development, almost from the school bench. Every year they announced something against us, so there is nothing new here. Those who turned out to be susceptible, when the states pressed them, naturally introduced these sanctions as well. As a result, the opportunities to create a common labor market, capital, work, services from Lisbon to Vladivostok, the formation of the Eurasian Union instead of the European Union, all these opportunities were not realized or lost. And the West has always considered us only as a source of inexpensive mineral resources. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the large-scale crisis in the economy of Russia, we were really trying to weaken and, in fact, to tear it apart into parts as an unpleasant competitor. But it did not work. I will say now, maybe such a tough thing, but nevertheless I will say. In my opinion, our relations with Europe have reached the point of no return. Unfortunately, there is no one to talk about anything in the old world today. Moreover, even with their predecessors, European leaders just shrunk, were born instead of bright personalities and strong leaders. There are some simple technical figures, and it is precisely the Russophobic orientation. Here, for a long time, a famous American leader was shown. I want to say that the current leadership of the United States, and we also know different ones, in this sense is different from the Europeans. As you know, Donald Trump is a person with bright, sometimes very paradoxical character traits. But we must admit that in his team there are professionals, charismatics, well, in general, personalities. This inspires a fragile, I would say, careful hope for the possibility of a negotiating process. But European leaders, they are all timid and cowardly puppets. This is the danger and sadness of this situation. The same applies to their vision. Any principles they easily sweep away. If it smells like fried, they do any business according to a scheme that is quite accessible to them, from diplomatic bluff, which was around the Minsk agreements, to the shameful vacchanalia, which we all saw, for example, during the Paris Olympics, from attempts to impose on us a set of very strange values, to direct support of the Bandera people and rewriting history, from the theft of Russian assets and blocking of our mass media, to repressions against citizens for supporting Russia, or criminal cases against strong competitors at the elections. By the way, this is, so to speak, a story that did not exist before. They used to criticize us all the time for some, according to them, retreat from democratic institutions. And now they began to clear their own political field. The clutches and clusters of these European clowns under the former team from Washington could even be something funny, if not for one thing. They became the cause of a colossal number of human tragedies in very different places, and the basis for a possible severe retribution. Now, for European politicians, everything has turned upside down, and the current president has gained courage and called not Russia responsible for the Ukrainian crisis, as it was claimed for many years. Well, according to the clear political laws, the laws of the political genre, he called his predecessor responsible. But in fact, this is a recognition that the United States, Europe, and, of course, the Kyiv murderers are the leaders. I will not now clarify to what extent the leaders of the United States depend on the so-called deep state, which drives their actions. In any case, many European figures have ears from what happened, and the reflex worked, but do not underestimate their capabilities. Therefore, on the agenda, what to do. And here I want to say about 7 theses or positions. The first, it is necessary to complete the victory special military operation in Ukraine, and it is necessary to destroy the Kyiv neo-Nazi regime. But it is the regime, and not the state, whose fate is a question of the future. If these bloody freaks, headless, say something, then far from always they say it on behalf of the Ukrainian people. It is necessary to take all measures in order to revive such regimes in any other country. Never happened. Too high price. And taking into account the negative experience of the 40s, about which I have now said enough in detail, it is necessary a real denazification. Nazism must be eradicated not only in Ukraine, but also throughout Europe. And as an ideology and to carry out this work, it is necessary to be decisive joint actions of different states. And who does not want to do this, he must directly mark as an accomplice of Nazism. This applies to any country in Europe and in the world. They just have to understand this. For us, they are the accomplices of neo-Nazism. The second. While the special military operation continues, the legal goal for our armed forces are not only the servicemen, but also any mercenaries from Western countries who fight on the side of our enemies. I remind you that with the prisoners of war, we treat them in accordance with the norms of international law. We guarantee them life if they voluntarily surrender. However, from the responsibility for crimes against humanity, this does not free them. There can be no mercy for the murderers of peaceful people, extremists, and terrorists. They should be waiting for a severe retribution. But it is not only about foreign mercenaries. What else do I want to say? Foreign contingents, which are now loved to be discussed, which are voluntarily offered to be placed in Ukraine, I must say this directly, are enemies. They are combatants of the foreign army and our legal goal. Those who put forward such stupid ideas under the guise of regulation should cut it on their nose to avoid major troubles. After the completion of hostilities in Ukraine, and the creation of conditions for a long-term peace, it is necessary to create an international tribunal of its kind, Nuremberg 2.0, which will give a legal assessment of the actions of all people involved in the Kyiv regime, sponsors, ideologists, customers.
Совершенно очевидно, что с этой ролью не сможет справиться Международный уголовный суд.
It is quite obvious that the International Criminal Court, this is a strange, in fact emerging international structure, without any commitment and even without force. The international community needs to create a new structure, an alternative to this very Hague court, and its jurisdiction must be distributed to crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, as well as acts of terrorism. International cooperation within this body will allow such crimes to be prevented. Our possible partners in this dialogue will not want to do this work. Well, our national courts. So it was after the Great Patriotic War, during more than 2 decades of open trials in 1943, 1944, well, up to 1949, the facts of the cruel crimes of the Nazis were revealed and severe sentences were issued to the guilty. This is not only the Nuremberg trial. There were only the leaders and, as we have just found out, to put it mildly, a very small part of them were punished. And such court hearings in our country took place in many major cities of the Soviet Union, which were most affected by the atrocities of the Hitlerites. Smolensk, Bryansk, Veliky Luka, Minsk, Riga, Kyiv, Nikolaev, Leningrad. The third thing I want to say is that at the same time, it is necessary to thoroughly reconsider the status and activities of international organizations that carried an hostile, purely pro-Western position, and for these years completely compromised themselves. They just need to be wiped out from our country with a bad broom. But on the other hand, life takes its course, and we need to think about concluding new basic international documents in the sphere of economy, finance, because such documents will contribute to the development of all states, not just the elected states. Fourth, now I will express my position since we have such a lecture conversation. In my opinion, the fate of Ukraine is to a large extent predetermined. I want to emphasize again that this is my personal opinion. It is not clear how long its remnants will function, who will need them in the pragmatic Western world without energy resources and industry, without prospects and potential. And of course, there can be no speech, as the leadership of our country and the president of our country, so that the remnants of this dying, disintegrating power could someday, even after the longest time, join any other military alliance that will stand for no alternative world order. We need to do everything so that this does not happen. I will even say more. These bilateral agreements of Bandera Ukraine, which they sign with certain European states, they are also a threat to our security. After all, they often use the following words in their rhetoric. We need an analog of the Article 5 of the Washington Agreement. Everyone knows what this article is. This is the collective self-defense of the NATO states. But our opponents must understand what difference does it make to us, whether the Article 5 of this Atlantic Agreement or some other article of the agreement that they concluded in a bilateral order is acceptable. Now 2 more words about Europe, which we are also a part of. More precisely, about the European Union. Everything they are doing now is such a weakness without courage. I am sure that the citizens of the European Union will get tired of all this pretty soon. They are writing about it now. I even see reviews of ordinary Europeans on what is happening, but in the near future, they will become some independent person or actor.
Я смотрю даже по своим социальным сетям отзывы обычных европейцев по поводу того, что происходит.
If America, the United States, as a large and self-sufficient state, will remain afloat even under the most serious shocks, then this miserable structure called the European Union is quite likely to disappear. I will say such a tough thing now, but nevertheless, taking into account how they have been behaving all these years, we will watch the processes of the degradation of the European Union without mercy. That is why our country is now interacting with the United States, along with our other main partners. Although this is a very difficult interaction, I know this not by ear, but you need to interact with them, not with frightened satellites in a lab. But nevertheless, they inflate their cheeks and do all sorts of nasty things. Now, we are working to bring this dialogue to a pragmatic plane, taking into account real circumstances, interests, and opportunities. Moreover, the two largest nuclear countries, such as the Russian Federation and the United States, are doomed to cooperate. This is not a split. This is a normal historical process. There is probably no whole nation in the world, I emphasize, who would consider us, Russia, as sworn enemies. We are always talking about individual scoundrels, corrupted groups, elites, but even the most active Russophobic propaganda is unable to fool everyone in many European countries. They were not able to completely quarrel with our country, although they tried. Moreover, all these fed-up scoundrels let the peaceful citizens of their own country eat cannon fodder when they attack various objects, even nuclear objects, or refuse to cooperate with us. After all, the Easter truce announced by Putin was violated by Kyiv's leaders almost immediately. This, by the way, angered even those who had illusions about Kyiv. Let's see what will happen on May 9th. Europeans are demonstrating against further support of the Kyiv regime and their cherished dream, just like the dream of most Ukrainians, to be driven out of the fire and left alone. Therefore, the 7th. There is no new world, and there can be no dictatorship and pressure that leads to imposing values that are not shared by all nations. We have already seen what this can lead to. The international community and radical nationalism and the incitement of religious and ethnic differences, the propaganda of the way of life that goes against traditional morality. It is important that the system of international law guarantees all states the right to safe development. This is how I bring it all together, and there should be a new world order in place of the so-called order based on the rules that the Anglo-Saxons introduce. Only such a world order can lead to the stable development of our entire human civilization. The completion of the special military operation of Russia's victory is the first step to a strong world in Europe and the construction of a new global world order in the future, which will, of course, be based on mutual respect and justice and stable development. For all of humanity, this is the only way to look confidently into the future. This is what our partners who represent the majority of the world, the global South, the East, Asia, Africa, Latin America, we have more friends than enemies. It only seems that there are many of them because they are very active and we have more friends. This is the most important thing. Dear friends, we will have to work hard in different countries with different people and generations. I sincerely hope that you, as well as the young people, will be able to take the most active part in this work.
И в этом, кстати, солидарны наши партнеры, которые сейчас
We all
представляют
understand that the global world order may take years or even decades, but we have to create it otherwise. We will not survive.
друзей на самом деле
You have to direct your energy and will to this.
недругов, противников. Это только кажется, что их много, потому что они очень
I would like to finish my speech with the words of Konstantin Rokossovsky, our Marshal of Victory. He said that the people who honor their heroes can be considered great.
Всем будет кропотливо вести в самых разных странах.
We honor our heroes, and that is why we know that victory will be ours.